Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the podcast that has just been endorsed by Taylor Swift. I'm Dorian Linsky. On today's show, Labour MPs voted to pass Starmer's cut to the winter fuel allowance, but at what cost? And how did this policy turn into a political crisis? Plus, Kamala Harris took on Donald Trump in the first presidential debate since Joe Biden's Ragnarok. What did their dynamic tell us about the campaign ahead? Let's meet today's very happy panel. First, political journalist and Westminster editor for The Lead, Zoe Grunewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
Dominic Cummings, who gave us a lot of great audio content back in the day, has been saying more about his new startup party. You wrote about it for The Eye. What is the point of another new party on the populist right? Is this just hubris?
Good question. I think the thing is that the right is lacking identity, right? So they're all kind of sparring. All those big figures on the right are all sparring with each other. So we know the Tories are incredibly divided. They're searching for a new leader. Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, they're not really welcome within the new Tory party. They're seen as pretty much solely focused on the issue of immigration. And I think for Dominic Cummings, this idea behind what he calls his startup party is it's actually more about changing the way Whitehall is run and changing the way politics works and taking power away from what he considers to be the elites into the hands of the people. In some ways, it is very similar to a lot of those right-wing movements. So there are focus on immigration, there are focus on culture war issues, there is focus on tax cuts for small businesses and things like that. But there's also this sense of actually like the way that the Conservatives were doing politics was wrong. And what is quite interesting is he talks a lot about needing to make sure they're clamping down on tax avoidance from the top 1% and seizing back some of that money. So it is, I would say it's slightly different, but ultimately all these things kind of come down to this sense that, there is a group of people at the top who are governing not in the interests of people. And you're right, in that sense, it is populist.
And parties do need compelling leaders to sell them. It's hard to launch a new party anyway. Is he aware that he is a deeply charmless and alienating man?
I think he is aware, to be fair. I don't think he cares. And I think, he seems to think that actually the fact that he is rubbing everyone up the wrong way and is, as you say, charmless and alienating and abrasive is actually in his favour because it proves that he doesn't want to be part of the elite, which is all very well and good, but you have to get people to vote for you and you have to get people to give you money. And I don't think he's going to do any of those things very successfully.
I think, unfortunately, some dislikable people fall for the myth that being dislikable shows that you're doing something right.
Yes.
You're ruffling feathers, you're over the target, and it's like you just might not be a very pleasant guy.
The other thing is, as much as he did have some interesting ideas, he's actually synonymous with a lot of failures. He was part of Boris Johnson's government. He was involved in the scandal around Barnard Castle and breaking the COVID rules that he helped to create. The COVID inquiry shone a light on how he created this toxic, misogynistic atmosphere in Whitehall, which made it really difficult for them to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, he was the architect or very much helped the Vote Leave campaign. And the more we learn about Brexit every day, the more disastrous it seems to have become. So it's not even that he's like, this wild, wacky maverick with this like CV of successes. Actually, if you interrogate what he's done, it falls apart fairly quickly.
Here to talk about other dislikable people is associate political editor for The New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe.
Hello.
So in the latest round of the Tory leadership contest, poor old Mel Stride is out.
Yeah.
And Robert Jenrick is on top. Do you feel confident right now in predicting which is the final two that will go to the membership?
No, not at all. So the Conservatives have decided to have the longest and most convoluted leadership contest format that they could possibly have. So for people who haven't necessarily been following the ins and outs, we had 6 candidates at the start. We've had 2 eliminations so far. Now there's a break for a month. The final 4, they're not even the final 4, the current 4 are going to conference where they're all going to get speeches of about 20 minutes to make their case to the membership. Then there's more MP voting, and then there's final 2, which we'll find out in the second week of October. And then we've got another 3 weeks of members voting, and we're going to get the results. I love this. We're going to get the results on the 2nd of November. So just as everyone's trying to get their head around Rachel Reeves' budget, and where there won't be a Conservative leader in place to respond to the budget. So it'll be completely sort of overshadowed by budget coverage. And even if like that we'd sort of stopped talking about the budget a bit and we were about to get back into, other political stories, we've then got the US election coming up. So it's like the worst possible timing. But the way the contest is being organised makes it really difficult to predict who's going to be in the final two, because there's only 12 votes now separating Robert Jenrick, who came first, and Tom Tugendhat, who came fourth, because there are so few Conservative MPs. And a really good, strong conference speech from any of them could put them in the final two. Equally, a slightly naff, disappointing one, even for Jenrick, even for Kemi Badenoch, could mean that they're not. So no confidence whatsoever.
Some people out there might say that Jenrick is a greasy opportunist who speaks to centrists out of one side of his mouth and sort of Brexity, anti-immigrant hardliners at the other. Is that sort of just why he's doing well?
See, I think that's actually really unfair to him, because I don't think he has been speaking to centrists, at least not lately. He's very much pitched for the right of the party. And one of the reasons he is top is because he really started laying the groundwork early. Some of his supporters say that his decision to resign as immigration minister in December, like that was the first step in showing that he had integrity. He has been spending the summer like really, as opposed to Suella Braverman, who had to be sacked, or Kemi Badenoch, who stayed. So that's the comparison.
Right. Okay.
And it's been sort of assumed since January that Kemi Badenoch would obviously be the next leader, and she has assumed that and done very little groundwork among MPs who will either say that she's brilliant and refreshing and intellectually exactly what the Conservative Party needs, or incredibly rude and divisive, and they'll go for anyone apart from her. And she hasn't really done the charm offensive that you kind of need to do. And obviously she went on holiday over the summer when Robert Jenrick and others were working very hard trying to go up and down the country at hustings and things. So he is clearly going for the same set of voters that she's going for. James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat are sort of battling it out to be the not crazy right-wing candidate. I think, though, it comes down to who can charm the membership more. And Kemi Badenoch has been quite impressive in some speeches. Robert Jenrick is not known as being a fantastic orator. So once we get a sense from conference as to where the excitement and the enthusiasm is, you're going to see those votes start to coalesce. But it really is all to play for at the moment.
It's just amazing to me that Jenrick is anywhere. Our guest today is Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at University College London, specialising in Middle Eastern politics, Julie Norman. Hi, Julie. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks. Hi.
So last week, Foreign Secretary David Lammy suspended 30 of the UK's 350 arms export licences to Israel. This managed to enrage Netanyahu and the US to some degree, while disappointing supporters of the Palestinians. What was the logic behind such a limited move? Did it achieve anything?
Well, I do think it had symbolic impact, and we saw that in the reaction in Israel. They saw this as a slight, especially coming after the UK also pulling back on a planned challenge to an international criminal court proceeding that's in process against Netanyahu. So they definitely are feeling the shift from this government. In real terms, it won't have that big of effect. It's 30 licenses out of over 300, and that amount is less than 1% of all arms to Israel. So it won't really have a military effect there. But I do think it shows Labour trying to find some kind of middle ground on this very fraught and very contentious issue for the world, but even within their own party.
Because this week, Israeli forces killed a Turkish-American activist and their missiles struck a humanitarian safe zone in Gaza. It just seems like we've been in this situation for sort of months and months. Where are the red lines for its allies? Is there anything that could happen that would make people turn off the arms taps completely?
I think we've almost like passed any potential red lines that would have been there. So any moves that would have been made with the current governments and current leaderships that we have, I think have been, have come and gone months ago. I think a question, with the U.S., if there is a Harris administration, if they would play this any differently in terms of some of the U.S. decisions regarding arms to Israel. But even that I would see is very unlikely. The U.S. sees this in political terms domestically, but also in their interest in the region. And they see everything in a much broader lens, threats from Iran, et cetera. And I think they'll be reluctant to pull back any kind of aid to Israel right now. But again, the more the conflict goes on and the more the humanitarian crises go on, countries may be pushed to make some moves they wouldn't have considered in the past.
Well, we'll come to Harris later on. Let's begin. On Tuesday, MPs voted on the government's plan to cut the winter fuel allowance for around 90% of pensioners. It passed comfortably despite 53 Labour abstentions and one rebellion from the left-wing veteran John Trickett, plus opposition from all the other parties coming together in a rainbow coalition. It's designed to help plug the so-called black hole in the nation's finances, save around $1.4 billion a year. But it's become a huge political flashpoint. Among many critics, Unite Sharon Graham accused the government of picking the pockets of pensioners, which is not easy to say, so particularly when you're cross. Rachel, this has managed to unite Tories, Greens, Reform, trade unions. Did the government realise that this was going to be such a controversial move? Did they think it would sort of go a little more smoothly than this?
So I think they were pretty naive, actually. And I say that as somebody who is supportive of this policy. And we can talk a bit about why.
We will.
But just in purely pragmatic, strategic terms, this was a policy that clearly Rachel Reeves, the Treasury, looked at the economic case for it and went, yes. And their work sort of stopped there. They didn't do the work that you have to do of preparing and laying the groundwork and really, explaining it. And Labour's defence of this policy has been one line, and that one line, it's not even one line, one phrase, which is £22 billion black hole. Like, that's the defence. I was in PMQs this week, and Keir Starmer got a number of questions on it from Rishi Sunak and also from other MPs, and that was basically his defence. Black hole, black hole, black hole.
Well, Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, said the government had no choice, but of course there are always choices. That doesn't seem like a good.
The government did have a choice. They could have refused the recommendations of the independent pay advisory board about public sector workers and train drivers and junior doctors. Now, doing that would have increased the risk of strikes and industrial action that we've seen as really ground parts of the country to a halt over the last couple of years. It would also, and you could make this case, be really unfair to cut the wages, essentially a real terms cut, of public sector workers who have had their wages frozen since 2010, while still giving a benefit that is universal and therefore goes to some of the wealthiest in society. You could make that case. They didn't make that case.
Yeah.
They didn't have their outriders in the media and on TV and newspaper columns going, actually, this is why it's the right thing to do. They have sort of hidden behind, we have to do this, we have no choice, as opposed to actually explaining why the policy is fairer and, in my view, less regressive than the current system. And I think that just shows total naivety.
So on the policy itself, Rachel's put her cards on the table. Critics frame this as taking money from the most vulnerable. Defenders say that wealthy pensioners should not be getting payouts. It's pointed out that Elton John, I don't know why people always mention Elton John, but he probably doesn't need the £200, £300 when he turns 80. The Tories seem to have forgotten the means testing was in their 2017 manifesto. Do you think that there is anything wrong with means testing per se, ending this as a universal benefit, leaving aside how it's being done?
I think there are problems with means testing. I don't think means testing in itself as an idea is wrong, but I think there can be problems with means testing. It can be inefficient and expensive. What Labour have done if they've tried to just have it so that anybody in receipt of pension credit can claim the winter fuel allowance, which is a fairly kind of easy way to figure out the threshold. But, that if you means test in other ways, so people are talking about potentially introducing a tapered system or maybe just trying to assess individuals' income, I mean, that's when it gets incredibly expensive and it kind of defies the point of doing it in the first place. People also argue that means testing can distort incentives. People below a certain income, it reduces their incentive to earn more, so they can be in receipt of the benefit. And it can also be really brutal. People a couple of pounds over the threshold might not be in receipt of the benefit, and then somebody who earns has a tiny bit less income will be, and it becomes unequal. So yes, there can be issues with means testing. It's not a perfect system, and I think the issue a lot of Labour MPs had with this when they were trying to consider what they should do and whether they should vote in favour of the proposal was that they felt that the pension credit element of that means testing was quite harsh, and actually there could have been another way to do it, which maybe would have been slightly fairer, or maybe would have had potentially not the same impact financially, but would have saved a bit of money here and there. I think one of the big problems with this policy, and same with Rachel, I do agree with it in principle. I think, that quite clearly there is a wealthy subset of pensioners who probably shouldn't be receiving pension credit. But I think the problem for this is that DWP, the Department for Work and Pension systems, are archaic. They're legacy systems. They're not properly hooked up with HMRC. And so this can only be done in a fairly binary way for it to be done. And, there are a lot of people, we know only about 2/3 of people who are eligible for pension credit currently claim it. There are a lot of people who could be getting it but won't be able to be reached by the system, because the system doesn't really work properly. It doesn't work in the way it should. So I think, what Labour will have to do now is have a really big push to get all those people who would struggle without this, who aren't claiming pension credit, to make sure that they do. But, especially when you have an older group like pensioners who are vulnerable, it can be really, really hard to convince them or reach them so that they do claim the allowances that they are entitled to.
Julie, one thing that has surprised me and quite a lot of other people is the fact that this was announced in August, when there maybe wasn't that much to talk about, and has been causing controversy for weeks now, and was not wrapped up in a larger package where you could see all the different choices that Reeves was making and that it would sort of make sense. Is that, do you think that's the big blunder, basically sticking it out there sort of shivering and alone without any kind of context or storytelling?
Well, yeah, I mean, as someone who's fairly new to UK politics that has watched this story unfold, I think, Rachel and Zoe both said it right. On the one hand, there's the messaging, which I think Labour just messed this one up. They could have been a lot better. As someone who's been trying to follow it, it hasn't even been clear to me exactly why they needed to do this and what other considerations they made. And then also just the policy itself, this question of who qualifies for a credit. We were talking before, do persons with disabilities qualify? Is it all by income? What are taken into account? So I think there's a lot of things going on that I'm not sure why that was not more intuitive to Labour to unroll in a different way. I can see some logic in one getting this out way ahead of winter so it doesn't come as a shock to people, in December or January. And also maybe for Labour just trying to get the dirty deeds done as early and quickly as possible and move on to other stuff they want to do. But it did seem like a bit of a toe stub with how they rolled this one out.
Rachel, it's being framed in some sense as a bit of a virility test, welcome to the big boy table, you've got to make tough choices. Is that something that Labour wants it to be seen in that way, or does that sort of take away from the kind of rights and wrongs of the policy itself if it just seems to be like a discipline issue?
I don't think Labour wanted to be having a row this divisive and this controversial this early on. And as I said, I think that the rollout of it was poor and it was misunderstood how much backlash there would be, and also that the backlash would come from the Conservatives, obviously, because that's the Conservatives' job, but also from the left of the Labour Party, from the trade unions. I think that they really underestimated how much anger there was going to be around it. And, I don't really have very much sympathy for that, because anyone who's been paying attention to British politics over the last decade could say if there's, one group whose perspective and whose needs are often elevated in the public discourse, it is pensioners, because they tend to vote at higher rates, and therefore people pay attention to them. And we talk about pensioner poverty, which is a very real thing, a very distressing issue, but we talk about pensioner poverty in a completely different way than we talk about poverty for working age adults or for children. You are twice as likely to be living in poverty in this country as a child than you are as a pensioner, and yet the debate around benefits for working families with children is framed in a very different way. But I also think that when that controversy came, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have seen it as an opportunity to show how tough they are, and to show right from the get-go that they're going to have to make tough decisions, which is a phrase that they keep repeating, and therefore they will weather the backlash and they will weather the pleas from their own MPs, because that's what they're going to have to do. And they want to set the tone now that they are not a government that is going to announce something and then backtrack on it, because that makes them look weak.
Well, the SNP are calling it austerity. Now, I feel like austerity was a huge program of cuts. It was a political project. Like one cut in itself is not austerity. But there's another part of this messaging problem is the government giving off austerity vibes, even like the language of kind of like tough choices, things are really hard. It's like, well, that was what we were told in 2010. So even if they're not also, going to be closing down the nation's remaining libraries or whatever, do they sound austerity adjacent?
Yeah, and it's not just this. One of the other things that Rachel Reeves announced over the summer was cutting in capital spending on infrastructure investment, which was a very austerity-coded policy. And we are right now in 2024 dealing with the consequences of those cuts in 2010. I mean, I think the SNP are being deeply cynical, because if public sector workers had also not got the pay increases, in fact, when the public sector workers didn't get the pay increases under Conservative governments, the SNP branded that, austerity as well. It's very easy to say that the choices are straightforward when you're not the one who has to find the money for it. But I think already there is a danger that this government, which was voted in because people wanted change and hope and wanted to feel better, is leading with the sentiment that things are going to get worse. I mean, I watched Keir Starmer's speech in the Downing Street Garden a week or so ago, where he literally said things will get worse before they get better. That is not the vibe you want 2 months into a new government.
No, that was amazing. We're going to come back to that in the extra bit, actually. But I was like, don't say that. So you're a generational warfare correspondent. But as Rachel suggested there, when Gordon Brown introduced the winter fuel allowance in 1997, poverty was much worse among pensioners than working age people. Now, thanks to triple lock and other measures, the reverse is true, although if you look in polls, pensioners refuse to accept this, that anybody is worse off than them. So, I mean, would this policy, are we looking here at a policy that simply would not be introduced today, that it's sort of sacred to a lot of people now it exists, but there would be no justification for it?
I think it was clearly right for Gordon Brown to introduce this when he did. I think, we saw that pensioner poverty was much more severe in 97. It was a policy that served a good purpose, and now we can see that actually pensioners have gotten a lot wealthier. The only thing that kind of springs to mind about this is obviously we are dealing with a crisis of energy prices going up and up. And last year, when it was particularly bad and people were really, really worried about whether they were going to be able to heat their homes and stay warm, you could imagine a drive or an initiative from the government to make sure that particularly vulnerable pensioners would have that money. So you could maybe imagine something like that being introduced. But I think, what Rachel actually spelt out really well earlier, which is that, there is almost this sense that pensioners have become politically untouchable, right? And the Tories definitely courted this when they were coming towards the end of their time in government, because they knew that only pensioners were still voting for them, and it was really, really important that they maintained that support. And I think, even though, I've spoken to a couple of Conservatives and they've said, actually, we probably would have had to do something about the winter fuel allowance had we come back into government. And actually, most of us do support this. So, some of this outrage that they are producing now is manufactured, I think, from the Conservative benches. I think it's quite political. Yes. But, there's definitely been a sense over the last 5 years of this generational culture war being introduced and really being used for the Conservatives to have political capital. And therefore, when Labour came in, and Labour have spoken a lot about social mobility, about they don't use the term levelling up anymore, but sort of levelling the playing field and trying to give young people a better start in life, that had to be at the extent of some of these things that have been protected for a long time.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, the politics of it is very strange because, as you'd imagine, you've got the currently suspended Labour MPs. They all sort of voted against it, and people like Zara Sultana making a big point almost that this was kind of a left-wing position. But then you've got other people like Jonathan Porter's going, but you know, hang on a minute. Have the left not been saying for quite some time now that the benefit system is weighted hugely towards pensioners, that there is far more outrage around this than there is about any of the cuts to younger people. By younger age, I mean simply like working age. And saying, but isn't some kind of more generational kind of equity what we were calling for?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting point and something I've been thinking about. And I think, you know, it goes back to some of the things that have already been said, which is that part of Labour's messaging around this could have been, look, your grandchildren and your children are going to have a really tough time. And we can see that, you know, last week there were all sorts of headlines about how children are receiving the worst NHS care they've ever had, how there are more school exclusions than there have ever been before. You know, all these things that we can see that are playing out amongst young people and children, and having this conversation around we need to really work to slightly reweight this so we are giving more opportunities to our children to ensure that also, you know, to ensure that there are people working in the NHS to support you when you're older. And I think having that conversation about the generational imbalance that's gone on, it is difficult because pensioners have political capital and children do not. But it is really important. And I'd like to hear Labour make that case a bit more strongly.
Quick final question, Rachel. One of the things coming from the left, for example, Sharon Graham, is that there's a sort of simple alternative: tax the wealthy, tax the profits of energy companies. That does sound very appealing, but that it always does. Just say it to get the rich people. Is there a problem?
So there definitely is a problem with the way that income is taxed and wealth isn't in this country. And that's something that economists on the left and the right say we need to look at, because wages are stagnating and wealth is concentrating in the hands of those who already have it, particularly when it comes to property wealth and house prices, which is one of the reasons why I think the winter fuel payment as a universal benefit is regressive, because I'm going to use my favourite stat, which listeners will probably think I made up, and I just want to say to start off with that I got fact-checked on this by more or less on the BBC, that if you are over 65, you are more likely to be living in a millionaire household than you are to be living in poverty. More than a quarter of pensioners are millionaires. They have assets worth over $1 million. Now, you can argue about assets being tied up in housing wealth and whether it's fair to look at it that way. But when you're speaking about people who have no assets at all, who do not own their own homes and who can't even begin to imagine that, paying for a benefit that is going to people who have property wealth worth millions, something has gone wrong in the system. Now, Sharon Graham and others have made the wealth tax argument. I haven't been able to make the figures add up, because she said this week that a wealth tax would raise 23 billion. The TUC's own analysis has suggested it would raise 10 billion. So, you know, they've already doubled the amount that they think that they can get from this in a year. So I'm not quite sure where those figures came from. But the thing about wealth tax is you can only really do it once. And winter fuel allowance, pensioner benefits, these are things that happen every single year. If it were that easy, if there was this pot of money that we could just tap into and it would have no consequences whatsoever, previous governments would have done it. I think Labour should look at housing wealth, should look at inheritance, should look at the balance between taxes on income and taxes on wealth, but there isn't like a magic wealth tax button you can press that will make all this go away.
It's a bit like, taxing, reducing tax avoidance. It's like, well, obviously, but,
no one's ever thought
this. And there's just this idea that this is a sort of giant pot of gold that nobody's just thought to open. Politics is hard.
Who knew?
Tough choices are being made. Next up, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump clashed in Philadelphia on Tuesday night in their first presidential debate. In fact, their first ever face-to-face meeting. They got on very well. The last debate between Trump and Biden was one of the most decisive in history, forcing the Democrats to switch candidates. This one was very different. Most pundits decided that Harris had prevailed by a wide margin, although Trump supporters thought that Trump had won. Interesting. Julie, Donald Trump is clearly cognitively impaired. Should he step down?
Whoa. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting how the shoe is on the other foot now in terms of who is perceived as the older, more doddering candidate. And I think Harris tried to tease that out a little bit in the debate. But honestly, she didn't even need to go there. I mean, I think, knew the rather niche, somewhat like questionable things that really get under Trump's skin, with the size of the rallies, with, like people who like laugh at him or whatever. And she got those out early, rather strategically in questions that they made no sense to put them there. But she got them out there, got him on the back foot early, and he struggled, I think, to recover. And regardless of one's political standpoint, I think people observe that.
Because some people are saying he had a bad night, but he didn't seem like any different to how he normally is. Isn't that just like how he speaks? That he doesn't answer questions. He does digress and riff, and he can't say something without doing the little kind of the intensifier. So when he's talking about spheres of terror, and about terrorism, and he goes, horrible terror, which is the worst kind of terror.
It is.
And it's like he's got all these kind of tics, and he almost sounded like a Donald Trump impressionist. So it's sort of, it doesn't, did it seem like, oh no, he kind of lost his way, or is that just what he does?
Oh, I mean, I think unquestionably that's just what he does. And that's why most of his supporters were not that thrown from this debate. I don't think he will lose votes because of this. This debate needed to reach those undecided voters, or those who were kind of begrudgingly going to vote for Trump but were curious about this other option, and trying to reach those individuals with a debate that showed that Kamala could be in control. Like she dominated the tone and the momentum of that debate. I don't think she was perfect either. She was very light on policy. She had, some other things that could have, other people could critique. But in terms of showing that she could command the conversation and that she could handle Trump, was something that I think she needed to show, and she did.
Because one of the arguments that people were saying that one of the problems that Biden was making, and I don't know if I did identify this as a problem at the time, was that he was so kind of angry and worried about, the future of democracy. And that was why he kind of didn't want to step down, because he still thought he was the person best placed to beat him. What came across was this real like anger at this kind of semi-fascist, whereas Harris has this kind of like, this fucking guy smile. Mm-hmm. And do you think that was the right technique there, where it's almost like a constant eye roll?
Well, it's worked up till now, kind of this like smirk politics, whereas Biden, I think, he kind of blew up Trump in the public mind as like this huge boogeyman threat that like by all means had to be defeated. And that worked for a few people, but I think not for enough. Whereas Harris has taken the opposite tack of trying to make Trump look small, at laughing at him, laughing him off, mocking him. And that has at least gotten her even in the polls. It's still an extremely tight contest, but it's made up that gap that Biden was really lagging with.
Zoe, I think I'm the only person here who watched the whole thing. It's fine. It's not a flex. I hated it, but I'm just checking.
Yes. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched, I did my research.
You got a flavour of it, right?
Yeah.
You got a flavour. Right. So CNN calculated he made 33 false claims, 3 of which, I think the 3 most egregious, were sort of fact-checked live on air. Do you think that there is the problem with covering this election that we've seen in the US political media is that Harris is being judged on the old rules of politics, like, maybe you're a little light on policy, or, did you answer this question properly? Whereas with Trump, it's like if he fails according to all of those kind of benchmarks, and the media almost just has to go, well, has to kind of do this thing called sane washing, where you sort of spin everything that he says as if like, well, what I think he meant to say was.
Yeah.
And did you get that dissonance watching it, that they're really just they're being graded on completely different curves?
I think because he is the Republican candidate, you have to give some, not legitimacy, but you have to try and interpret what he's saying, even if what he's saying is baseless and makes no sense. And it's, really frustrating. I mean, I only have to talk about American politics when I come on a podcast like this, or when I'm talking about the front pages. if I was trying to understand Donald Trump, I would probably go mad, because there are so many lies just peppered throughout everything he says. So many things so many strange tangents. You know, the weird thing about it was ages ago, but it was like, you know, he was talking about something. I think he was talking about shootings. Then he was talking about shark attacks, and then he was talking about electricity. And it was.
Would you rather be electrocuted or eaten by a shark?
Yeah, it was that kind of level.
Yeah.
But even that, you know, that.
Can we talk about eating pets?
Right. And yeah, eating dogs, eating cats. I mean, it's just all insane. And, you know, I think the reason it has been quite a successful technique for him is because, just quite frankly, it's really hard to debate a liar. If you're trying to talk sense into someone who will just lie without consequence, then you yourself will either become incredibly frustrated and lose sight of your own point, or you will become too wrapped up in trying to disprove their lies that you'll forget to sell yourself. So I think for Biden, especially because clearly by the end Biden was getting very exhausted by the whole thing, it was really successful. He just didn't have the energy to bat against Trump.
Because she did push back and she went, well, I'm not banning, I'm not banning fracking. And then you don't want to defund the police and that kind of stuff. But there was just so much. There was just stuff that was coming in, and he would just go, millions of, criminals pouring in. And he goes, they say the number's this. I think the number's this. And actually, it's probably higher than I think.
Yeah.
And you can't even, the moderators can't do it. She can't do it, because otherwise you'd constantly be going, no, crime is not going up. No, unemployment is not doing that. It's like you would, everything he said, you would just have to go no.
And I also think, for Harris, women are held to a different standard in political debates. And if she had attacked it as a constantly, no, that's not true. You're done the whole, he's just so dangerous for democracy, she would really have been at risk, I think, of him turning that in a similar way he did with Hillary Clinton and being like, she's hysterical and she's, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Whereas that smirk, that eyebrow raise, that this is just ridiculous, I'm not even gonna credit this with a response, I think is a far more it's more appropriate, but I think it serves her much better, because I do think if she was looking like she was kind of, going for Trump and rising to his bait, that could have easily been turned against her.
Rachel, what I found interesting was, in a sense, that you did get to see people as they are, and there was you got to see both of them as they are. And there is a criticism of the debates in the UK that actually people were being, particularly the ones with 88 people on stage, and just this kind of nobody was could really kind of get an answer out before they were being interrupted. Did you think as a debate, 90 minutes, no audience, chance to respond, sometimes multiple times, that it kind of worked, at least doing the job of a debate, which is showing the country this is who these people are? I
think debates in the US work better than debates in the UK, full stop. And I think that's because the US has a presidential system, so you are actually picking an individual. Some of the debates that we had in the general election, where there were 6 or 7 people on stage and none of them were running to be prime minister, they were all deputy leaders or other people from those parties. They're just a bit weird. You're trying to transplant one format that works in one political system into another. I'm also really debated out. I watched all 3 of the 2016 ones against Hillary Clinton. And I was just thinking exactly what Zoe was saying about how Hillary Clinton really tried to call Donald Trump up on the lies. And I remember her saying, that's not true, that's not true. And she sounded petulant. She sounded like a kid going, that's not true. And maybe she should have been tougher and gone he's lying. Maybe that would also have had the kind of effect of making her look sort of hysterical. I also remember Trump pacing up and down outside, behind her.
Oh yeah.
A bit like a shark or like a caged animal. It was very weird. And so I thought this format, I didn't watch the whole thing, which you did, Doreen, but I don't think Trump left his lectern to pace up and down back at various points. So I think this format was better than that. But fundamentally, it's a different system. Our politics is smaller. It's parliamentary based. It's we have more parties, although we have two major parties, but we have the impact of other parties. We've got regional impacts as well. So whenever you have a debate in the UK, the SNP and the parties in Wales and Northern Ireland also say like they should be involved, and they've got a case for that. Of the UK ones, the one that I thought worked best, to be honest, the only one that I think was actually worth watching was the Sky debate where they didn't debate each other. They got grilled by Beth Rigby and they took questions from the audience. And that was the one where I feel like we actually got a sense of who the candidates were. All the other ones I feel like were kind of window dressing, dare I say it, thought up by producers who spend too much time watching American politics.
Julie, it's hard to say what Trump wanted to talk about in policy. He wanted to blame immigrants all the time for everything.
Pets, eating pets.
Well, I want to kind of I'm going to get to that later, the actual details of that, because it's quite kind of, it's pretty dark, I think, what's going on there. So he's talking about immigration all the time. The one point that he seemed to make that was in any way valid was like, well, you're talking about all this stuff you want to do, why haven't you done it before? Which, of course, is the argument that kind of, Starmer could make against Rishi Sunak. It's like, well, you're already Prime Minister. Did Harris have strong enough responses to that? And maybe anything else that you thought was kind of, I never felt she was on the spot, but do you feel that when he did have an attack line that she had a good response?
Yeah, I will say, I do think, in this debate and going forward, that is going to be one of the best things for Trump to press on, is this fact that Harris has been in the administration for 4 years, trying to A, link her to that, and B, say, why didn't you do more like that you're saying you would do, and why have your policies changed? And she legitimately did not really answer either of those things in the debate, but she was very effective at deflecting and pivoting to things that she wanted to say. And I think she did that effectively on a lot of the issues, including immigration, which is Trump's other, real go-to issue. And I think that essentially seemed to be his debate prep. Any question that you don't know, spin it back to saying something bad about immigrants, and that's your tack. And it just didn't work. She was ready for that, and she was able to respond effectively for the debate.
Which policies did she choose to focus on?
So I would say the biggest issue for her and where she really hit her stride in this debate was the conversation around abortion. And we could see that in some of the, the dial responses, that's really when people watching really picked up and were donating and enthusiastic about her. And she was very well spoken on that. She gave very specific examples of the way some of these new laws have affected, incest victims, people needing like urgent emergency care and couldn't get it because of these restrictive laws. So she was very effective there. Trump was not. And I think that will continue to be an issue that she continues to speak to very much on the campaign trail. She's strong on it, and they know that Democrats and many independents care a lot about that issue.
And she has been criticized for having a lot of holes in her policy platform. I mean, are there things that she still needs to tell people that she's expected to? She hasn't done sort of sit-down interviews and press conferences. She hasn't been grilled that much. Are there areas that you're looking at and you're just going, look, there really isn't much sort of meat on these bones?
Yeah, she's come out with an economic plan, this opportunity economy. I do think there are some nuggets of nascent ideas there, but those are going to need to be fleshed out. Some of the big ones, like the price controls, were, kind of hit a wall very quickly, and they backtracked on that. So I do think for most American voters at the end of the day, the economy and inflation are going to be two of the biggest issues. So I do think communicating effectively on those are going to be important, and continuing to hit the right message on immigration. Right now, I think she's been effective in saying, look, I helped broker a bipartisan bill back in February that Trump pressured Republicans to kill, but it would still, I think, benefit her to even be able to say more about what she would do instead of just saying like, yes, enough, that hasn't been done enough in the past. Because that issue, as we can see, is going to be one that Republicans are watching, and moderates and centrists as well.
Gaza is still a big problem for parts of the Democratic base. It did come up. Harris said that she had always been a supporter of Israel, but she also supported a two-state solution and an end to the war. Trump answered what he always does, is a weird counterfactual thing. And he goes, well, if it had been me, if I was in charge, this would never have happened. Everything would have been fine. He goes, I could end it in a day. I'll call them up and then just say, stop. So we're not going to talk about his plan. Has Harris dealt with that in a way that's going to kind of stem the loss of votes that we were seeing, for example, in Arab American area parts of Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who follows the Middle East very closely, I and others are certainly watching her messaging on that. It's one that I think she's trying to avoid as much as possible because it is, just like here, very fraught within the party. And so I doubt that we will see much of a change in her messaging up through the election. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, she is still the vice president of Biden at this time where they're trying to still get a ceasefire deal in. She can't really go too far away from what he's saying to jeopardize that. The second is just electorally, if she leans too much more the Palestinian, like pro-Palestine side, she will lose a lot of people who lean more on the Israel side. And again, the party is very split on this. And third, I think, is really just, again, U.S. policy more broadly. It's the U.S. has tried to walk this middle line in the Middle East. They have a lot of interest at stake, and it's going to be hard for her to depart too much from what's already been done. But I do think her rhetoric matters, the sense of empathy to, hostages that was lost on October 7th, as well as Palestinian civilians, dying and suffering in the war. She needs to keep that going to keep the party on board with her.
Zoe, Trump obviously talks about making America great yet again. But he very apocalyptic in his language. He talks about the end of destroying this country. He talks about the end of this country, the end of Israel. Oil will be dead. We'll have World War III. That came up quite a lot. And Harris is talking about turning the page, more in common. I mean, it seemed to me like I can't think of a more striking contrast in sort of like, it's literally just like the hope party versus the fear party.
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of people, just similarly in the UK, we feel like things are very divided, we're very divided. And some people like that. Some people capitalize on that. I think some of Trump's supporters like the idea that it's them against others and, there's a conspiracy against them and they are uniting and finally getting a voice. But I think for voters who aren't decided, I'm sure that a lot of those voters will be motivated by just wanting the country to be in the safest pair of hands as possible. And the message that must resonate most with those people is, I'm going to bring the temperature down and just get on with governing. Whereas Donald Trump, he wants to divide us. He wants to cause mayhem. He wants to stir up all kinds of things. He's not just ridiculous, silly, weird, self-serving. He, is irresponsible and would rather divide us for his own narcissistic supply than he would actually hold America's best interests in heart. And I think that is quite a convincing message if you're somebody who just doesn't know which way to cast your vote. I think you're more likely to cast in hope than in fear.
I just don't think most people think that Israel will be destroyed within 2 years, or that this is the worst economy that we've ever had in the history of America. It's like that sort of apocalyptic hyperbole. I was like, well, who's that resonating with? Some people, I'm sure, do believe that.
I'm so convinced, and I think it's the same here, that a lot of what these right-wing politicians do, and some of the left, but like a lot on the right, who want to stir up, trouble or division. A lot of it is sound bites that can be, posted on social media and can hit a particular group who might not be as politically engaged, but they will hear something like that and it will trigger them, and they'll think, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah. Rachel, the debate prompted Taylor Swift to publicly endorse Harris Waltz on Instagram, which people were very excited about. People have been hoping she was going to do that, and she did. And a lot of it was very sort of measured. But she signed off as childless cat lady, which is obviously a dig at J.D. Vance. And the polls are revealing like a bigger gender split than we are used to. Did you think that played out in the debate? Did you really have a sense that this is an unusually gendered election?
I think you did have that, because Kamala Harris talked about abortion. She talked about abortion, as Julie said, in a very measured and calm way, but also a very emotive way, sort of focusing on the victims of these policies, whether it's victims of rape and incest, whether it's women who can't get emergency miscarriage care, whether it's families who can't get IVF treatment because of some of these policies. And I have been closely watching US politics for coming up to 20 years, which is terrifying, as a sort of observer. And Democrats have often been very reluctant to talk about abortion nationally because they worry that, or they have worried that it's divisive and it will hurt them. And they sort of say to women's groups, they have said to women's groups, yeah, we're the party that will protect Roe v. Wade, but we don't want to be defined by that issue. And one of the things that we've seen since the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago is women mobilizing for their reproductive rights, sometimes in states where you wouldn't expect it. Whenever there have been ballot initiatives to safeguard reproductive health care, surprisingly, because some Republicans have put these ballot initiatives down, and they have been, women have come out to vote for them in numbers that weren't really expected because this wasn't considered a mobilizing kind of issue. So I think it's gendered in that way because that issue has become frontline politics in a way that it wasn't in the last election.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all the reasons, yes, Harris definitely has a plus in that area because she's able to talk to abortion. And, even though she's not focusing on it, obviously she would be the first, female president. But I think also Trump has a minus. I mean, let's not forget that he was found liable for sexual assault. We have all the, the comments from the past with, Pussygate and whatnot. So he already is at a slight deficit. And so you have a candidate like him in a much stark, I think, comparison to a candidate like Harris. And so we do see that gender divide a bit more.
And I think another thing, interesting thing in that Swift endorsement, she points out that this also operates on the Veep level as well, is that Tim Walz, she praised him for his kind of support for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights. And J.D. Vance has introduced this whole kind of new kind of weirdo, like online conservative misogyny, which is it's not the kind of like oafish, gropey misogyny of Trump.
It's like podcast misogyny.
Podcast kind of like really worried about who's having babies and who isn't kind of misogyny. So it seems like it's happening across the ticket.
I also think the Swift endorsement matters because it could be aimed at people who wouldn't necessarily vote, i.e. young women who have traditionally voted in lower numbers. And Zoe will probably have the numbers on this, which I don't, but when Taylor Swift suggested that people register to vote a couple of years ago and the number of registrations just went through the roof at that point, these are people who wouldn't necessarily be politically engaged, but are. So it matters in that sense. And Swifties for the Kamala Coalition, which launched in August, have raised more than $138,000. So there is momentum here. I thought she did it, though, in a really measured way, basically saying, I've looked at the evidence, make up your own mind. This is why I'm doing this, but everyone should do their own research. But she also mentioned, and this is I think a really disturbing element of this election, the AI fakes put out by the Trump campaign, the deep fakes suggesting that she and her followers had endorsed him.
I mean, I think that was the real factor because you just go, we're watching the debate as maybe, one, I don't believe Taylor Swift sat through 90 minutes of that. And two, she'd obviously been thinking about it. There's obviously been drafts of the statement before. And I wonder whether that was what tipped her. It's just like, well, fucking hell.
If you're going to use my name and my image anyway, it might as well actually come from me.
Yeah, and remove the ambiguity.
Yeah.
Moving swiftly on. Julie, Harris has been ahead since entering the race, but the polls are still kind of, to me, alarmingly close. I mean, just watching that debate and you're just like, is this a tough choice? Is that just the nature of American politics, that it is polarized along party lines, it's dependent on narrow margins, it's constantly coming down to tens of thousands of votes in Pennsylvania? Like, we're just not, is that just the way it is? Or is there something that Harris should be doing that she isn't that would make this a much wider gap?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, right, it is neck and neck. The New York Times poll this week actually had Trump up by 1 point, but like everything is in the margin of error. So Harris has made up ground, but it's essentially split now. I do think that is not going to change much between now and the election. For the reasons you said, the country is pretty much people know, especially with someone like a known quantity like Trump. It's not like there's going to be some October surprise or some like gaffe from Trump that like we haven't heard before.
I don't know what a Trump gaffe would be.
That's it, right? He's beyond that. So I don't think that'll change much. But I do think that, again, Harris has had this kind of honeymoon period. She has the good vibes and what have you. But I do think she is going to need to lean a little bit more into the substance stuff as she gets closer. Because again, I don't think Trump will lose voters. She's not going to take people away from Trump. But I think the question is, independents, people who might just sit this one out or do a write-in, will they actually cast the vote for her? And that's where some things like, mobilizing young people and getting people out to the polls, that's going to be very key for her.
Has RFK Jr. Pulling out and endorsing Trump made any difference? Because he was polling, I don't know, sort of 5% or less, and a lot of people thought, well, his voters are Trump voters, but I don't see huge difference in the numbers.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was expecting Trump to get more of a bounce from that as well because of the numbers RFK was polling. And again, my sense is that a lot of those people are not going to Trump as much as that's that kind of middle will I vote, won't I vote category that is really up for grabs now for Harris. And if I think she stays the course, and is clear on her messaging, some of them will come over and it might be just enough to push her over the threshold.
Thanks, Julie. Well, if you're listening, don't watch the whole debate. Just watch the highlights and memes because I just got very angry. Before we go, let's share some of the stories that we think have gone under the radar this week. Rachel.
COVID inquiry, which is still going on, and phase 3 began on Monday. This is the phase that's looking at the pandemic's impact on the UK's healthcare system. England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland sort of separately, but also sort of the NHS as a whole. And I know we've kind of got a bit bored of COVID, particularly in Westminster, although it did come up in the election campaign. You still had people on doorsteps citing, Partygate and the sacrifices that they made versus what was going on in Downing Street. But, Westminster, a lot has happened since COVID for Westminster. But there's been some really interesting stuff that has come out about the state that the NHS was in when the pandemic hit, and the fact that hospitals were already operating above capacity of 85%, which is the level that's considered safe. You had huge burnout, you had staffing shortages. It was in a very fragile state, and then COVID hit. And there's a report out later this week that Wes Streeting has commissioned on the impact on care that wasn't COVID related but didn't happen because hospitals were dealing with that. And there were some really tragic stories about people whose conditions didn't get treated and have now reached a point where they couldn't be treated, or people who lost loved ones not from COVID but because they couldn't get appointments to be treated. And I think it's worth paying attention to, partly for the future, because we may face another pandemic, and also because it actually informs a lot of the debates that Labour are having at the moment about economically inactive people, i.e. who are not in the workforce because they are long-term sick, and how you grapple with some of those issues.
Julie.
Yeah, I mean, one story I've been following this week is our Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in town here in London meeting with David Lammy, and both of them today are in Kyiv meeting with Zelensky. And one of the things they're discussing there is removing some of the restrictions on the use of long-range weapons that Ukraine could potentially use, for cross-border attacks into Russia. So for security, foreign policy wonks out there, this has been a big ask from Ukraine for a while. It would be a very big boon for them, I think, in Biden's last months for him to give the green light to that. So that's something I'm definitely watching that could be a not a game changer, but definitely shift some of the momentum in the war in Ukraine.
It's been very interesting, I suppose, in that apocalyptic language. The World War III is coming. We were told constantly, if there was any military action against Russia, then he would go nuclear. Well, and, Ukraine went into curse. No, hasn't happened. And so it shows, I think, how sometimes that kind of constantly going World War III is serves the interests of certain people.
It's true. And I would say, I respect Biden for that restraint to some degree. When the war was first starting, there really was a question. This could escalate extremely rapidly. No one knew Putin's calculations. Would there be nukes deployed, attacks on Poland, what have you. And so the incrementalism is often criticized, but I think it was to some degree necessary. And in hindsight, we're why didn't you do this sooner? But the fact that they are coming around to this decision now, I think is notable. unforgettable and will be worth watching.
I just want to point out I'm not in favour of World War III. Don't clip me.
I was in favour, though, of you saying, go nuclear and actually being literal.
No, exactly. Why be figurative? Zoe?
Okay, so this is a story that isn't really a story, but it's doing the rounds on Twitter and it's just really irritating me. And it keeps coming up on my Twitter thanks to Elon Musk's algorithmic changes that highlight annoying right-wing commentators that I didn't even know existed. But they're all getting very annoyed at the minute about the fact someone tweeted out on English Heritage site, on the English Heritage site, they allow people to come and visit their site. So all these lovely areas of England, Hadrian's Wall, things like that. They allow them to come, they allow refugees to come and visit these sites for free, which I think is a lovely idea, lovely programme. Obviously, the right is furious because they're like, why do refugees get to come and see these sites? And me, as an Englishman, can't see them for free, you know. And I just think it says a lot about the hypocrisy of the right, because on the one hand, they always try and frame this argument against immigration or against refugees as an issue of integration. And then when you have genuinely really interesting initiatives to integrate people and to let them, visit a piece of English history and learn about our culture and our history, the right are up in arms about it. Yeah. And I just think it's a perfect example of how it's all confected outrage.
They come over here, they visit our ruins.
Yeah, they try and learn about our country. Yeah.
They eat our woke scones.
So there was this kind of complete myth that was going around that Haitian immigrants in, I think, Springfield, Ohio, were like eating cats and dogs, which they're not doing. There was one picture of a guy, I don't know who he was, holding a goose, but you're allowed to eat geese. They're generally not pets. They're apparently a delicious Christmas treat.
They're not that nice.
Oh, I don't know.
Quite stringy, dry.
But they don't do vegan goose, so that tells you something. And some people go, well, this is kind of a bit like on a blood libel. Like this is such a mad racist lie. And on one level, it's sort of comical. And then on another level, it's like, it's super dark. And that some people, however much it's debunked, are going to believe it. Similarly, the claims that Trump claimed that that there were people that were being aborted, babies that were being aborted after they were born. They were just being executed, which again, that's not true. And in fact, and abortions are not happening in the 9th month. There's one recently where he said that children were getting gender surgery without parental permission in classrooms. They were going into school, and then coming home, and they transitioned. And again, like quite apart from all the logistics of doing that surgery in a classroom, completely untrue. But what worries me is that you kind of, even as you debunk them or fact check them or laugh at them, you think, well, are you participating in this? And these really sort of grotesque lies behind which lie, racism and misogyny and transphobia. And you kind of gasp at them and go, you won't believe what this fucking guy has said. But how do you make sure that you're not being a part of spreading that? So even me talking about this problem is that part of the problem. And there's all these different kind of sort of cognitive approaches to this, like the truth sandwich, where you kind of make sure that the truth is on either side of the lie as you're repeating it. But the idea that you can just go, well, let's not just talk about this mad bullshit that's online, but Trump is saying it in the debate. So I still don't think there's any kind of like perfect way to deal with such gross disinformation. But I'm worried there are some people out there that just think that Haitian immigrants are eating pets.
Yeah, I think, when we were talking about the media coverage before, I think the media has wrestled with how to cover Trump's outrageous statements. And I think people felt they gave them too much attention, perhaps, in the past elections, gave him too much airtime, and also just made these talking points more viral. And I know even today in my own commentary on other stations and stuff, I've tried to caution, like, okay, how much should I mention the cat and dog thing? Because you don't want that to be picked up. And yet it is just bizarre to me that a fact check in like a US presidential election is like, actually, it is not legal to execute babies in any state. Like that was literally a fact check, like that was said in the debate. And it's just like the fact that had to be clarified to people just shows what Trump will say. And that, yes, and you're right, true or not, it is out there then, and it gets a life of its own.
fucking guy. That's the show. Thank you so much to Zoe.
Thank you.
Rachel.
Thank you.
And our guest this week, Julie Norman.
Thank you.
The extra bit is coming up after Demon is a Monster by a Corner Shop and the latest roll call of the Patreon supporters whose generosity keeps the podcast alive and well. You could join them for as little as £3 a month and get the podcast early without ads, plus lots more enticing offers. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. And we'll see you next time.